Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2022 podcast series produced by the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group of the Worldbank Group. As complexity and uncertainty become the new normal, with complex crises posing new challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, this podcast series explores how the international community can best support countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence in a fast-changing global landscape.
My name is Kushla Thompson. I'm an economist and policy analyst, the Development Cooperation Director of the OECD. In this episode, we'll be speaking about financing for stability in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. For this discussion, I'm joined by two speakers, Mr. Frank Bousquet, Deputy Director of the IMF, coordinating engagement with fragile and conflict-affected states, and Joachim Bejma, Chief of Mission for the Embassy of Sweden in Democratic Republic of Congo. Operating effectively together in fragile environments can be extremely challenging. You have different development, humanitarian, and peace actors, different types of resources, and really complex interlinked problems that need to be addressed. Responding to fragility is clearly not only up to humanitarians and not only up to the UN. Through COVID-19 and the current crisis in Ukraine, we can see how important the economic actors are and will be, including the IFIs. So many of the world's conflicts have a strong economic and governance dimension and need to have economic and governance solutions. And of course, the bilateral donor community is also critical, with diplomatic sway and as the main funders in fragile contexts. Joachim, there's a DAC recommendation on the HDP nexus that calls for financing strategies, engaging these different actors and funding collective responses. In DRC, Sweden has been active in bringing together donors, IFIs, and the UN around the table and developing such collective strategies at the local level. Tell us about how this worked, what made it an effective process. What lessons would you take away from it?
Thank you, Kushla. As you say, we've been leading what is called the Nexus Donor Group in the DRC together with the UN country team. And this is a work that actually tries to facilitate the implementation of the DAC recommendation at country level. So we started in 2019 with a joint analysis, mapping of stakeholders, and then we worked out collective outcomes across the three pillars, peace, humanitarian, and development pillar. And based on these collective outcomes, we then moved on to try to look at, okay, how are we financing these collective outcomes? What is the existing financing in the country? We zoomed in then on provinces because to try our experience here in the DRC was to try to do this at the national level to get all the stakeholders around the table and to agree on a joint finances strategy nationally was too big of a piece to chew at the same time. We also had the fact that the peace building mission MONUSCO was transitioning out of some parts of the country, the Grand Kasai in the southern part and Tanganyika in the eastern part. So this was also a good opportunity to show where the Nexus implementation could be more successful, linked into the need for prevention of conflict in these areas. So we zoomed in on the Grand Kasai, where we worked out a light joint strategy. We identified the stakeholders around the table in that province, what different financing they had available from the three pillars, and arrived then at a package for this part of the country. And now we're about to do the same thing in the province of Tanganyika in the eastern part. And I think what we have taken away from this is, first of all, to try to work at the decentralized level makes it a little bit more tangible. It also, from our experience, it was very helpful that we worked at the political level. We engaged the donor countries at the ambassadors level to both visit the Kasai, but also to discuss it at the political level. And of course, to support the UN country team at the country level as the facilitator of this process. I think it's been a good run so far, and we're looking forward to the continuation.
Thank you for that. And Frank, the IMF is itself shortly launching a new strategy about how to operate in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. Other IFIs are also running or have run similar processes. And there is this broad recognition that at the national level, those governance and macroeconomic interventions are critical. Tell us, what will that look like for IMF support to countries in practical terms?
Well, thank you, Kushla. I'm very happy to be here with Joachim from Sweden, a key partner engaging in the fragile and conflict-affected states. So first, why, as an institution, are we enhancing our focus and engagement in fragile and conflict-affected states before going into the strategy? First, they represent about 20% of our IMF members. That's significant. But as you know, over the past years, you can see that definitely fragility landscape is worsening. What does that mean? It means that it's not only looking at those countries, but also looking at the spillovers from fragile and conflict-affected states that have an impact in terms of stability for neighboring countries and regions. So what is the added value of the fund? Looking at its own mandate. It's not a question of going beyond our mandate. It's a question of leveraging our core competency. The fund is a global institution with a responsibility to address threats to the members' economic stability, including, and that's your point, your question, Kushla, those coming from fragility and conflict. So fragility and conflicts are macro-critical, and they are therefore directly relevant to our mandate. Now, the fund has been engaging for a while, and it has a long-standing engagement supporting fragile and conflict-affected states. In fact, it has helped many countries achieving macroeconomic stabilization, but also laying the foundation for sustained growth, and also building stronger institutions, central bank, Ministry of Finance, which are critical to exit fragility. And the strategy, I would say, has three buckets. The strategy that we are going to discuss with our board shortly will aim really at enhancing the fund effectiveness and impact in fragile and conflict-affected states, in full line with its core competencies. So the proposed strategy is looking at three buckets. The first one is really greater tailoring to the fragility and conflict context. What does that mean? It means strengthening the calibration, the tailoring of the IMF engagement to the key drivers of fragility and conflict. Governance, you mentioned it, Kushla, it's one of them, but there are many others. And here it's about looking at how can we better take into account those key drivers of fragility and conflicts that are macro-critical in surveillance, but also in program design, conditionalities, or in capacity development, which is extremely important. So that's the first aspect, is how we can enhance the tailoring to the fragility and conflict context, obviously where? At the country level. Every country is fragile in its own way. Second point is about deploying more and better skilled staff in fragile and conflict-affected states to really enhance the dialogue with the authorities. In this set of countries, what is important is not necessarily what to do, but how to do it. So the whole point is to enhance the footprint of the IMF in those countries, once again, to better adapt the IMF support to the local absorptive capacity, make sure we focus on the top priority, better engage with authorities on a more regular basis, but also strengthening the partnership with all the partners like Sweden at the country level. And that's actually the third bucket of this strategy, which is really stronger partnership to amplify our impact. Progress requires unified effort. We may have a chance to talk more about it today during this podcast. And the whole point about the strategy is to strengthen the IMF collaboration with humanitarian, development, peace actors, bilateral partners, in line again with our core mandate, competencies, and comparative advantage.
Excellent. That's quite an ambitious bundle that you have there. We've talked and heard a little bit about the process that you went through at that subnational level, Joachim, and then, as you say, Frank, this country level macroeconomic role that the fund in particular has. I'm interested to hear how we put those two together. Joachim, do you have thoughts in your experience? How can the IMFs, the IFIs, the IMF, but also the development banks, how can they contribute to the types of financing strategies that you've described? What are the tips and traps you would suggest?
Thank you, Kushla, and thank you, Frank. It's interesting to listen to your perspective as well. I think for me, the IFIs are absolutely crucial. If you look at the big picture in the DRC, for instance, the state budget, executed state budget, the last year has been around $5 billion, and the total ODA coming into the country has been around $3 billion per year. And in that setting, of course, the investments of the global financial institutions becomes crucial. One of the objectives is, of course, to increase the state budget, to raise the state budget, but to do that, you need macroeconomic stability. So the fact that the IMF is here with first with a rapid credit facility, and now with an extended credit facility, with 1.5 billion over 3 years, and linking that to important reforms, creates the first step in that direction, and really helps other partners to be able to reach those reforms. The same is true for the Worldbank, that just took a decision on a new country partnership framework, where they will increase the investments in the country. They will double it, more than double it actually, and also linking it to reforms, putting clear milestones within different sectors, and also having a geographical focus to contribute to stabilization of the country. Another important thing is that the shift towards more human development with this new country partnership framework, which I think is also important to see in a fragile context. This also will contribute then to the collective outcomes. As I mentioned, the collective outcomes that we came up with here are one around food security, because the malnutrition is very, very high. One around social services, access to social services. One about gender-based violence, to lower the rate of gender-based violence. And the fourth is about internally displaced persons' access to social services and services in general. And I think when you look at these outcomes, and you see the IFIs, they can also contribute to these outcomes because they've been part of the conversation. I think the most important contribution from the big financial institutions is the fact that they open the door for others by their decisions, and they lead on reforms. So it becomes a results-based financing that other donors can piggyback and other actors can piggyback on, and also add maybe technical cooperation to be able to reach those milestones.
It's very helpful set of points there, Joachim, and it puts me in mind, Frank, we've heard you say before that, you know, the challenges in fragile contexts, it's not just up to humanitarians to fix. I'm interested hearing a little bit more, if you will, if there were a country like DRC or other fragile contexts, as a group of donors, the UN is thinking about their approach, including some of those humanitarian actors. They want to develop a financing strategy, for example, for tackling a specific issue like food security. How is what you do relevant to those humanitarians and to those working collectively to build peace? How can you draw those lines? What would you say to that group of donors and the UN in terms of the role that the IMF and the other international financial institutions can play?
Well, thank you, Kushla. I would say that, you know, every organization has a specific role to play. The issue that we are facing requires, obviously, an approach that goes beyond just humanitarian or development or peace or financial support. And that's why we are discussing today how we can best work together. We need also to recognize, I think, which is important, the importance of leadership and ownership. When we talk about reform at the country level, authorities have obviously a key role to play. And we should be careful of not having just discussion among donors, but really at the end of the day, you know, exiting fragility requires leadership, ownership from the country. So I think that's important to recognize. Now, for the IMF, I just mentioned that each organization had a role to play. For the IMF, I think there are really three areas in terms of comparative advantage. One is obviously the promoting macroeconomic stability, but also laying the foundation for inclusive growth. And that obviously we can help in terms of providing tailored policy advice, but also helping to address some balance of payment or fiscal imbalance, which are critical. The second point is really more looking at the long term, building institutional capacity for core fiscal, monetary, or financial sector policy function. This is essential in terms of helping countries exiting fragility. The third point is providing financial assistance when countries, of course, face balance of payment needs or financing gaps. And the last point, which actually Joachim mentioned, which I think is very important. Joachim said, opening the door for others. I would say also catalyzing support from the development of bilateral partners. Those fragile and conflict-affected states needs support from the international community. They need grant, and therefore the fund has a role in terms of catalyzing donor support by engaging, for instance, and catalyzing donor assistance. So, for instance, the fund can provide policy advice, but also supporting on reform, like Joachim mentioned, so that other partners can actually provide concessional financing, grants, and can actually provide the support that is needed for those countries. So really catalyzing donor support, like Joachim mentioned, opening the door for others is an important role that the fund has been playing and is also part of the strategy. And the last point about this notion of partnership, very important. All those challenges that those countries are facing, in terms of provision of security, rule of law, low state capacity, governance, low level of trust, potential spillover, it's very complex. And therefore, the whole point is to recognize once again that no single organization can succeed alone, and therefore so critical to have the support from actors that have really different but complementary mandate. The whole point about joining force with humanitarian, financial, development actors is obviously essential, especially in this set of countries.
Thank you, Frank. Joachim, there seems to be so much going on in the world at the moment where we see fragility increasing and the types of collective interventions and economic interventions have never been more important. Be interested to hear, what does success look like for both of you when we're trying to take this collective approach? How will we know when we're getting it right? Joachim?
Oh, thank you. That's $1 million question. But so let me just first, before I go into that, comment on something Frank said. I think it's important to recognize that he said we all have a role to play from our different institutions, and there's important this complementarity between us. But to really have that, we also need the coordination, and I think that is one of the important messages for me is, to continue to invest in this coordination, and it's us, the countries, often that need to do that. And then, of course, the multilateral institutions can facilitate that as well. But at the end of the day, it's up to us as the donors, as the countries, to invest in coordination and be ready to do that and to adapt our programs. So in terms of what success looks like, I think when we see that we use different funding streams, we use different tools and different institutions in a combined way to achieve results, then we know that we are successful. When we manage to do this together with local stakeholders, together with an ownership in the country, then we know that we are successful. At the end of the day, of course, it's the development results on the ground. It's to see that a part of the country is becoming more stable, less insecure, having less humanitarian need, and needing also less humanitarian aid in the end. Then we know that we're successful.
It's an extremely good set of points, and I like your reflection on the coordination aspect as well. Frank, the IMF coordination, comprehensive approaches, how do we know when we're getting this right?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we all look at the same objective. And if you look at the SDG 16, helping countries exiting fragility, helping countries to be more resilient to shocks, I think that's really the objective towards we are all working. Now, obviously, as I mentioned before, every organization will have a different goal within its mandate. For the fund, obviously, it's about being more efficient, more impactful in terms of helping countries to achieve macroeconomic stability. But also it's really having more tailored policy advice and programs fit for purpose, if I may, benefiting from the intelligence and from the skills, from the presence of all the other partners across the HDP nexus. So I would say it's about programs that are impactful, programs that help countries that will have strengthened institutions that will be able progressively to exit from fragility. Last point is that we have to be very humble and recognize that unfortunately over the past year, the fragility and conflict landscape is not improving. Fragile conflict-affected states are home to about 1 billion people. And when you look at it, it's very important that we scale up our engagement because obviously fragility conflict is also exacerbated by other trends, climate change, food insecurity, gender disparities, and that requires a comprehensive approach from all the actors.
Well, I think we can all only look with very sober eyes at how things seem to be going in the world in terms of fragility, and yet I think we've heard a lot today that can give us hope in terms of the openness to work together to respond to some of those trends. So I just want to take a moment to thank you both for participating in this podcast. We've heard a lot about the subnational approach that you've taken in DRC, Joachim, and the links between that and these big picture macroeconomic questions that we have to address as well. We've heard a lot about the importance of coordination, the importance of opening the door between the national level and the subnational level so that donors and the broader development, humanitarian and peace actors active in a country can really participate and be part of those bigger picture conversations, while equally those who bring the big financial firepower can really make a difference and respond at the local, concrete, very practical level, as you outlined there for us, Joachim.
This wraps up this episode of the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and please check out our other podcasts. For that, and to learn more about the Worldbank Group efforts in environments affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, please visit our website www.worldbank.org/FCV.